This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast, a podcast about local poets and the poetry that is important to them and the difference poetry makes in their lives. I'm here today with Barb Jennes, Poet Laureate of Ridgefield, Connecticut. Welcome, Barb.
Well, thank you, Sandy. Glad to be here. Oh, by the way, only Poet Laureate until April. We're looking for a replacement for me in Ridgefield. So if any Ridgefield poets are hearing this, please apply.
Got it. Thank you. I just want to introduce Barb as a former copywriter and freelance corporate writer and editor who's worked in the field of advertising, who has been a public school teacher, and has been Poet Laureate for the past 3 years, as well as poet in residence at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum down in Ridgefield. I can speak from experience that Barb is a very energetic, enthusiastic advocate and ambassador for poetry, as well as an incredible writer. Barb, why don't you introduce yourself as a poet and your relationship with this literary art form?
I have been a huge fan of poetry since I was very little. I can remember my grandmother reading to me from A Child's Garden of Verse, and that's really what got me hooked way back when. And then through elementary school, I would write poems and take them down to the office and say, "Here, put this in the PTA newsletter." So I've always been pretty good at self-promotion. And then, I focused on my English degree in college was with an emphasis on creative writing. But then when I entered the work world, poetry kind of got put in the corner where it was an occasional sort of thing. And then eventually when I turned to teaching, it became something I did with my students on a regular basis. But it wasn't really till I retired that I had time to really focus on it full time. And that's pretty much been my emphasis ever since, is writing it, teaching it, sharing it, encouraging other people to read it, write it, share it, and hopefully getting a few things published here and there too.
Oh, that's great. Can you just say a little bit more? What was it like as a child bringing the poetry down to the office? What was the adult response to your early efforts as a poet?
They were very polite, and they did publish them. And it was largely, they were poems I had kind of worked out with my mother. My mom was, although she never really pursued any sort of literary career. I mean, she really devoted herself to being a mother and taking care of the house, but she loved poetry, and she and I would work on our rhymes together. So she was, I think they knew if we don't print this, we're going to hear from Myrtle. So they were very polite.
That's great. And it's just so interesting too that your mom is your first audience and your first reader in a way. Nurturing that part of you at an early age is really, really important, that your voice does have a place in this world.
And I'm also a big reader of anthologies, poetry anthologies for children. And I give them frequently to people who are becoming, either new mothers or to friends who have children of an age where they can read by themselves. And it's really such a wonderful thing. When you read poetry with a child, whether it rhymes or not, it just enhances their sense of rhythm and their love of the language. So big advocate for reading poems with kids.
And I think poetry and kids, I mean, even the standards, the Shel Silverstein poems that are, some nonsense rhymes and are just playing with sound, really encourage the social nature of that literary experience too, that it's not meant to, light a candle in the dark of your room in the middle of the night and pour over this thing, but celebrate sound.
Celebrate sound, great way to put it. That's poetry, all poetry, whether adult, whether humorous, whether serious, should celebrate sound. The whole sonic nature of poetry is really, really critical.
So, and the fact that you're a fan of anthologies suggests that you really appreciate a broad range of forms and content and possibly cultural influences in the writing of poetry. I
have to clear some shelves off my bookcase because I have so many, not only single poet collections, but also my anthology collection is growing. And also my, here's how to write better poetry collection too, because we're all, it's kind of like, no matter how long you teach it or read it, you want to keep improving. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of anthologies, whether they're by large publishers or even small interest genres and themes.
That's great. Can you tell us about or share with us a poem that's had a significance for you over the years that you hold close to your heart?
I would love to. It was funny when you posed this as a possible question. I was like, oh my gosh, there's Shakespeare, there's Emily Dickinson, and then I really arrived at one. Of course, there's Prufrock too, which is foundational for everyone. But I arrived at one that I came across when I was in high school. And it really spoke to me. I mean, I was a very sensitive young person and was just really kind of formulating my interest in writing poems. So it's an Edna St. Vincent Millay poem called To a Young Girl. It wasn't until much later that I realized it rhymes. It was the content that spoke to me. So I'll read it if I may. To a Young Girl. Shall I despise you that your colorless tears made rainbows in your lashes and you forgot to weep? Would we were half so wise that eke a grief out by sitting in the dark until we fall asleep. I only fear lest, being by nature sunny, by and by you will weep no more at all and fall asleep in the light, having lost with the tears the color in the lashes that comes as tears fall. I would not have you darken your lids with weeping, beautiful eyes, but I would have you weep enough to wet the fingers of the hand held over the eyelids and stain a little the white frock's delicate stuff. For there came to mind, as I watched you winking the tears down, laughing faces blown from the west and the east, faces lovely and proud that I have prized and cherished, nor were the loveliest among them those that had wept the least. So I think, as I mentioned, being a sensitive teen, this just was like, oh, it's okay to feel this way. So it was the first time a poem had really spoken to me personally on an emotional level. I mean, yeah, there was intellectual level and a sonic level, but this was the time a poet had said, it's okay to me personally. So it was very healing. It was a very healing poem for me.
That's very, very beautiful. And hearing it, this idea that feeling things deeply and also publicly, to be visibly moved by something is okay, that we don't all have to feel like there's something wrong with us that we're moved by something. That's sort of, I guess what I would think of as sort of post-war stoicism, that the best citizens are the most stolid, and unmoved. That's not the case, that we need to be in touch with what makes us human. Absolutely. And what makes us respond to life.
Yes. And I agree with it. It was a post-war sort of thing where my parents were very stoic and didn't believe in expressing whether anger or sadness. Joy was absolutely welcome. Anything non-confrontational like that was just fine with them. But so yes, it was, poetry provided an outlet for those feelings, and finding other students and other teachers who really believed in the power of poetry.
I'm delighted that you chose a poem by Millay. I had a great uncle who was like a second grandfather to me, who was very intellectual, and he, when he was dating Aunt Ruth, before she was Aunt Ruth, of course, he would pick her up down in Bronxville, New York in his Packard, and on their drive back to Connecticut, she would read Millay to him. And years later at a book fair, I got a collection of her sonnets, and I was so intrigued by the way she married content to form. Yes. And really, once you enter into the world of the poem, it is so intimate and so beautiful. And the discipline that she employs to find the exact word to keep that meter and rhyme without calling attention to it. Like you said, it was years later I discovered it rhymes. Yes. Wow. Yes. You
have to admire poets who can do that. I mean, I play with form a lot myself, but not flawlessly as some of these, like Edna St. Vincent Millay do, where you don't even notice that it's in form. It's a real gift. For some people, it comes easy. Other people, like me, it's something you have to labor over, but it's worth it. And it's a wonderful thing when it fits in that wonderful sonnet box and rhymes.
Yeah, it is profound. And it just thinking about my own experience of Malay and hearing about how a woman read it to a man during their courtship. Again, the public nature of poetry. Could you speak a little bit about your role as Poet Laureate? What motivated you to apply for that position when it became available? And how this sort of sustainable Connecticut movement that has increased the number of poets laureate across the state has affected your relationship with poetry and local poets?
Oh, sure. It's wonderful that the number of poets laureate, or I always say poet laureates. I think both are correct. One is preferred, but it's wonderful the way that network of Connecticut Poets Laureate has grown. It's too bad that it has to be based on economics. It should be something that just should be welcome in communities. But as it was in Ridgefield, that was not a driving factor in the town creating the Poet Laureate position here. And I was one of several people who applied. I just really wanted to share my love of the genre, and having an educational background. And as it was, I was leading workshops at the library anyway, on reading poetry, and also one called Poetry on the Path. It's a one that's been going on for about 3 years now, where we get together either virtually or in person, read thematically linked poems, and then respond in either poetry or prose. And it's been a wonderful experience for people. It's very, again, it was billed as sort of a thing where if you're going through change, whether it's kids leaving home or divorce or illness, this is a wonderful community to join. And now it's just people who have no health or social issues that just love to get together and read and write. So, and also the idea of starting programs that would entice people to try this wonderful thing, and also to offer a forum for poets. I currently we just launched through Ridgefield Library a wonderful series. It'll be now monthly, called Poems from Connecticut's Four Corners. It'll be every first Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So far, it's going to be just on Zoom, and I suppose we'll keep that, because that way you can invite people from all over the state. And the format is we'll be having one poet from each of Connecticut's four corners, and then also a poet from the central Hartford area. So we'll feature 5 poets, and they'll be both emerging and established, which is a wonderful thing to offer emerging poets who don't necessarily always have the chance to read publicly, except for maybe in a very small local setting, to offer their work to a statewide audience. So really looking forward to continuing that. We had a wonderful first program in January, and looking forward to continuing that. But that really was the basis for my wanting to become the town poet laureate. We had just had Jericho Brown. I had studied with him at Bread Loaf, invited him to come and speak in town or read in town, and he did. It was months before he became a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. And I saw the reaction of that, how the community welcomed Jericho. And so I knew it was something I wanted to continue, to invite poets to read either in person or virtually, which became a necessity, because the month I became Poet Laureate, it was March of 2020, which is the month everything shut down. So the virtual forum was not only a requirement, but a wonderful tool.
And just on that note, with poetry from the Connecticut's Four Corners, if our listeners want to tap into that, how would they get on that Zoom?
Oh, thank you. I should mention that. If you go to ridgefieldlibrary.org and then scroll down to their events page and choose adult programming, there will be a listing there for each month. And probably even going forward, we're going to start posting several months in advance as the poets get selected. So ridgefieldlibrary.org. That would also give you access to a lot of the poetry programming we do here in town, which it's a wonderful market basket of programs.
So if a non-Ridgefielder saw something that was interesting, would they be able to come on down?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Either virtually or in person. All the programming through Ridgefield Library is free. I mean, that's one of their tenets, is that no program has a cost. So we've been having these wonderful, for instance, we haven't chosen a date yet, but in either February or March, we're going to have our second annual evening of rap, hip hop, and poetry. And we had 60 people there last year, which was wonderful. And we're hoping to have as large a group. That will be an in-person, because it's a really wonderful thing to experience in person. But we also record all of these events, and they're placed on the library YouTube channel. So if you're not able to attend in person, you can still, view the programming.
Yeah, I think your library has a very vibrant program. So if people are interested in, they could sign up for the library newsletter, I'm sure, and then stay informed that way as well. And let's hear it for our public libraries that make so much enrichment available to us all for free of charge. And we don't even have to get out of our pajama bottoms to go participate, And
not just poetry. I mean, oh my gosh, the wonderful programs offered throughout the state. I mean, I'm often attending programs through Stonington and Wilton, and just, we're so blessed to have such a powerful and creative public library network here in the state.
We are indeed. Barb, your most recent book is Blinded Birds,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
And this is a powerful collection that I have been reading through. I've been reading them as meditation. So I've been really taking my time through your work, because the poems are so poignant and so personal, and yet so available to people who might not know you and might not hear this podcast, but might just pick up this book. Could you talk to us about Blinded Birds and how you developed this collection?
Well, thank you. It's really, I describe it as a family story in verse. It covers 3 generations of women in my family, my mother, myself, and my daughter, who have suffered from genetically endowed depression and addiction. My mom was of a generation where depression was not treated. It was considered a personal flaw. You didn't discuss it. You didn't acknowledge it. So she really spent all of the life that I knew of her deeply depressed, which of course impacts everyone in the family. And then it's my part of the journey was I am a recovering alcoholic. This past Christmas Eve, it was my 15th year of sobriety. Thank the Lord. And also my daughter, who is a recovering heroin addict, who now is an addictions counselor, which is wonderful that she's sharing that knowledge and that wisdom with other people. So it's kind of our braided story of the 3 of us. Mm-hmm. And also the path to recovery for my daughter and myself is also there. So it's not, although it sounds like it's oh my God, that's depressing, which a lot of it is, it's also a collection that's not without hope. It really does end on a hopeful note of the possible. So that's how that came about. And also, most of it was beginning to be drafted when my daughter was still in active addiction, which for any parent who has a child who suffers from addiction, either alcohol or drugs or gaming or whatever, they know that pain, that rawness, and not shame, but just an inability to share that information, because it is still stigmatized. So you get very lonely in coping with it, either your own addiction or that of a child. So writing the volume was very, very therapeutic for me, and continues to be. When I read them now, I remember what it was like to be there, either in my own active addiction or dealing with my daughter's active addiction, and the courage it takes to overcome those obstacles. And by the way, the title of the book, Blinded Birds, comes from, it's an old Flemish tradition where they would capture finches, which have a beautiful song. And there was a competition called Winkensport, where they would have the birds repeat their song. And the competition was how many times could they repeat it in an hour. And what they would do to get these birds to focus only on singing was they would blind them, which is hence the Blinded Birds. And then the book kind of equates that to the idea of people with addiction, there is a very, very strong genetic link, and kind of the same sort of thing where you arrive a blinded bird having to sing your song. So there is in the book, a strong message about genetic, that it is a genetic failure or mutation, but then also there's the questioning of a God that permits this to happen. So anyway, that's pretty much the tale.
Yeah, and I mean, the opening poem definitely captures that and questions the God that permits it to happen. But what I am finding coming through the poems is the song, and the deep love and commitment to the soul of your mom, your dad, and your daughter. It just comes through so poignantly. And as I've read your work, it has struck me that it would require an incredible amount of courage and integrity to face those things head on and to say them, and then to put them in a form that is free yet disciplined. We talked about Millay and what she could do with the sonnet form, but you have form, and that's apparent in your poems. Could you just speak to your creative process a little bit? I mean, was it exhausting? Did the forms present themselves to you as you were working, or how does that come about for you?
It was a mixed bag. Sometimes I would challenge myself to write in a specific form. There's a Ghazal or a Ghazal in there where I was intrigued by that form and wrote a poem, which actually ended up being, it was one of the poems nominated for a 23 Pushcart Prize. So it shows that working in form can have good results, not always terrible results. But a lot of it was just, what came. I'm not one, especially when it comes to a thematic collection, I'm not one to say, well, now I got to write a sonnet, or now I have to, but occasionally I would challenge myself to do so. I guess, did that answer your question?
It does, for sure. And there's an organicness to your writing that just as a reader and as a reader of poetry, I'm noticing that the form and the structure speak to the content, that it's just totally works. And I'm just wondering too, what has been the response of others to your audience to your poems? Has your daughter read your collection?
Oh yeah, I would not have published it without her permission. That would just be too much of an invasion of her personal privacy. But she actually was with me when the book launched. We had a launch reading at the library here in town in Ridgefield, and she spoke to being a participant in this story, and also the aftermath and how it affects the whole family, of course. So she has been very, very happy to take part, especially now that she, as I mentioned, she's an addictions counselor. She feels, and I feel, we both feel very strongly that it's important to be outspoken about how there is no blame for this. This is not a personal weakness. This is something that so many families have to deal with. And better to be outspoken and an advocate for recovery than to hide it under a carpet, sweep it under the carpet. So she's been very, very helpful in conveying that this is something we all face in one form or another, whether it's a family member or a friend. I don't think there's a family in America that's not affected somehow by addiction. And so she's been great. And the reception, I'll tell you, every time I read from the collection, it's just amazing. People come up to me afterward and say, this is my family story. And it's true. I mean, so many people have gone through exactly what my daughter and I and my mother went through with the depression, or as a child living with a mother who was depressed, or as a child living with a mother who's an alcoholic. So it's wonderful to hear how they find it very healing too, and also affirming that, there is no blame. So it's been great. And professionally, the collection recently won a wonderful award, the International Book Award for a poetry chapbook. So that was a great acknowledgement too. It's been a finalist in several competitions, and so. To tell you the truth, what's more important to me is the personal affirmation from people who come up after a reading, or who purchased and read the collection, or borrowed and read the collection. I don't care how they read it. Just as long as you find it and find some healing in it, that's what's important.
For sure. And, there's the experiences that you reference in the collection, the sipping the foam of your dad's beer. I remember experiencing that as a kid, and alcohol was on the table, and I had the whole mindset. And I'm wondering if that sort of post-war stoicism, if the alcohol was what made that even possible, and I remember the liqueurs coming out at night when there was company, and these absolutely stunning colors. I mean, creme de menthe is beautiful, that green, and of course that would appeal to a young mind, and those things weren't forbidden. They were organic. And tobacco, the mothers had to smoke to deal with their kids.
Yes.
Marlboro selling their cigarettes that way, and I can relate to your learning in school that lung cancer kills, and the alarm bells that set off in me, because my mother had a long-standing relationship with the Marlboro Man, so your poems speak to that, and the sense that maybe I was part of a freaky family, and that we were the exception, but the humanity, and that the monster wasn't mom or dad, it was the substance that transformed our lives.
The monster is also genetics, and the monster is also the societal, as you said, like the stoicism, which may have played a major role in driving people to use substances back then and now. So it's nature and nurture working together to create that whole scenario, which can be very painful and harmful.
Barb, would you be willing to read one of your poems for us so our listeners can kind of have the experience that we're talking about and have that insight as well?
Sure. Now, I'm not going to read one from the collection, if that's okay. I found one that is actually a performance poem that links to the Malay poem I read, I feel, in a certain way, acknowledging emotions. So it's about my daughter when she was little, and it's called Wing. She wants to know why the hawk is in a cage, this august assemblage of talons and feathers, hooked beak, black eyes, preternatural stare. She wants to know why it isn't flying with the crows circling noisily overhead. It had an accident with a car, I say, reading from the sign. Look, she only has one wing. Like lightning, I see the connection forged between one-winged captive and Lilliputian empath, navigating a world where bad things happen to beautiful birds. A little girl who loves deeply. Her heart, a breeder reactor of compassion, churning out hope and desire for the miraculous, the impossible, the fairy tale commutation of carnage. She wants the bird to fly. For the rest of the day, it plays across her face, the longing, the what ifs, the Rube Goldbergian solutions to this insoluble sorrow. That night, the flight begins. Sleeping lids flutter like beating wings, muscles twitch, heart pounds with the first leap from a cliff. And I know that she is lifting the bird up, carrying it to the clouds, soaring so high she will never hear my warning. That there is only pain in becoming the second wing for a broken world. That's it.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, you took my breath away. Thank you. I hear a compassionate mother and a compassionate human being, then just the beautiful human being that you are coming through that poem, Barb, and the hard realities that we just can't change, that we have to face.
Try to help a child face too. That's really hard. And that's part of our job as parents, of course, but doesn't make it any easier.
No, which is why Malay's assuring us that it's important to cry and to be seen crying is a celebration of what it means to be alive. Thank you, Barb, for your time this morning. What a rich experience talking with you and hearing about you and poetry. It's healing power and the way it builds community. You've contributed so much as Poet Laureate of Ridgefield as a person, period. Could you just let us know if people want to read your poetry, what's the best way for them to find you in the ether? What should they do? Well,
first I want to thank you, Sandy, for this wonderful podcast series. It's so important to hear the voices of our poets. So, but if people want to see my work, Blinded Birds is available through bookshop.org or through I'm not sure many local libraries have it, but definitely your local independent bookseller. It is on the larger platforms, but I prefer people going to the smaller retailer. And then also for individual poems, I apologize. I don't have as of yet a really good website, but if you Googled my name, either B. Fulton Jennes, Jennes, or Barb Jennes, you'll see a lot of the poems pop up that have appeared in various publications along the way. So.
And we will put that information in the podcast notes so that people can find you that way as well if they're online. So thank you so much for joining People and Their Poems podcast today, Barb. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sandy.
Bye-bye.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.